People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Now, the pandemic's devastating socio-economic impacts have held a mirror to our society and compelled us to question our understanding of what it means to be vulnerable. Tonight's guest is part of a team that carried out a study to explore sources of household economic vulnerability to the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Reimagining vulnerability in the current Sri Lankan context is the topic of discussion tonight. A little heavy before the weekend, but a necessary conversation. I'm so pleased to welcome to the studio Dr. Ranmini Vithanagama, Senior Researcher, International Centre for Ethnic Studies. Good evening and welcome to the show, Ranmini.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Ranmini, now the overall study collected and analysed quantitative data from a random sample of 4,000 households from 9 districts, had 72 in-depth interviews from respondents in 6 districts. Speak to us about how the findings from both the quantitative and qualitative analysis shed light on the interconnectedness between economic vulnerability and external shocks.
An external shock is something that happens outside our system. So we pretty much have no control over what happens. So the pandemic is a prime example of that, and so is the economic crisis. So we did not have anything to do with what happened, but we had to kind of face and bear the impacts of those shocks. So your vulnerability depends on 2 factors: how significant and how strong the shock is, and secondly, your inherent ability to withstand the shock, survive through the shock and recover from the shock. Right. So your economic vulnerability to the impacts of these shocks depends on a number of factors, and they are what we call, by and large, pre-existing conditions. For example, what kind of job do you do? That would also depend on what kind of education level you have. It also, so income impacts the kind of assets that you might have, because it is influenced to some extent by your income levels and also your education, your financial literacy. And then much of our resilience also comes from the kind of social capital we have. Do we have relatives abroad? Do we have friends abroad? Do we have friends who are capable of taking care of us if something goes wrong? So these, what we call the asset pentagon: the human capital, that is education; the financial capital, savings, fixed deposits, even jewelry; then the physical assets such as land, and also access to natural resources and our friends and family and social networks. So all of this is important in determining how strong we are in the face of a shock. So if we are not, then chances are the impact will be that much more. We don't have a buffer and we suffer the consequences for longer periods of time, sometimes perhaps even permanently. Okay. So that's what we call economic vulnerability. So vulnerability is, of course, I have to also highlight that vulnerability is a forward-looking concept. You don't see that. So poverty, you kind of in an objective way we can measure using income or nutrition level, education. But vulnerability is a futuristic concept. So it's a risk of facing a negative outcome. So we don't observe it. So that's why economic vulnerability is not something we talk about so much during normal times. So it's only during a crisis that the issue of vulnerability kind of gets amped up.
Sure. But now we're also talking about how much of Sri Lanka is multidimensionally vulnerable. Exactly. How does that tie into this equation?
Yes. So vulnerability is tied to not just income poverty, it's also tied to non-income poverty, like I just discussed. So education is part of your, whether you have an education or not, is part of your non-income vulnerability. Okay. Whether you have social networks or not is part of your non-income vulnerability. Do you live in an area that has electricity, internet access? Do you have water? So all these are contributory factors towards whether you are non-income vulnerable or not. So they are kind of interconnected, but chances are if a person is income vulnerable, they are also non-income vulnerable.
Right. Ranmini, speak to us about how the economic crisis had an impact on households, particularly with regard to food insecurity, in light of the resilience vulnerability space?
Okay, so I will basically answer that question from the findings of our study.
Sure.
What we basically found out was that in our quantitative study, we found that most people at the time of the data collection were still able to eat 3 meals a day.
Okay.
But the quality of meals has gone down significantly, meaning more people could not afford to eat protein. They either had to skip meals or reduce portion sizes, and by and large, this responsibility of feeding the family fell on women, which meant women themselves used to cut down portion sizes or skip meals so that they could feed their husbands, elderly parents and their children. And what we found was that a significant determinant of household vulnerability to food insecurity is the income level. So households without income then had to resort to assets, liquid assets like savings, or semi-liquid assets such as savings or jewelry. So if they had savings or jewelry, they could then liquidate them and find money to feed their families.
Yeah.
But what we noticed during the economic crisis is that most poor households had run out of their savings, pawned their jewelry. So they did not really have a recourse by the time the economic crisis hit, which meant then they had to resort to what we call detrimental coping strategies, meaning again going without food altogether, or cutting down on nutritious food, cutting down on food altogether, eating what's just available in the garden to them, or feeding the children and parents going to bed hungry. Again, like women taking more of that burden.
We must speak about the gendered impacts of the economic crisis and these external shocks that we spoke about. Why do you think this gender dimension is not mainstreamed in Sri Lanka in terms of policy making and policy implementation?
I would say in Sri Lanka, there has been a lot of progress in terms of incorporating gender into policy documents.
Okay.
The issue is in the policy implementation gap.
Sure.
So there is on the one hand, there is a lack of institutional capacity.
Right.
Then on the other hand, there's a lack of institutional will. So while very good concepts and approaches are enshrined in these policy documents, they don't really take effect on the ground. And also because those policy measures are not enforceable legally, so there is really no way to kind of get them rolling on the ground. So that's predominantly a reason. And also, I absolutely must mention this, and the norms and values, we grow up with, what are women supposed to do, what are men supposed to do, and, how we judge men and women based on what they do and they don't do. So that's a very difficult barrier to break through, because we learn it consciously and unconsciously. From the time we were babies, we have been conditioned to understand what women are supposed to do and what men are supposed to do.
So this gender stereotyping and also this self-sacrificial nature that women are supposed to embody can have really detrimental impacts on themselves as well as their families and society, right?
Yes, actually what we found in the study is that during the pandemic, more women expressed feelings of guilt over being unable to take care of their babies, the fear of giving the virus to their kids if they contracted the virus themselves, fear for their parents, and on top of that, because of the collapse of these facial outlines, more men were at home, so they took out their stress of being stuck at home on women and daughters. So mostly intimate partner violence was quite high based on both findings from both our quant and qualitative findings, and in some cases alcoholism was involved. So even like a small domestic fight, like which channel to watch, would soon aggravate into a bigger crisis because men would let it out on women. And also, while more men were at home, they would actually just watch TV or play with children, and women were left to do the bulk of the unpaid care work, meaning cooking, cleaning, providing for children, bathing children and all of that. And mind you, during the pandemic, the workload actually increased because there was all kinds of home remedies that people adopted to kind of amp up their immunity. Steam inhalation, then disinfecting households, then washing multiple times the clothes, groceries, and having to bathe children multiple times. So most of it almost, according to our data, fell on women.
From this response, I'd like to come to psychosocial well-being, how we don't have a space for mental wellness, and how this disproportionately impacts men. The fact that therapy or mental health awareness is so demonized, how it disproportionately impacts men, and how its impacts are felt by women.
Exactly. Yes. So men are kind of conditioned to believe that they are the breadwinners. Their success in the eyes of outsiders in society depends on how he is able to provide for his household.
Yeah.
So when that was taken away during the pandemic, men were stuck at home. So they took up maladaptive practices, such as going out, violating the social distancing guidelines, or like I mentioned, alcoholism. So the way they took out their stress had a disproportionate impact on women, because on the one hand they had to discipline men not to go out, and that would result in domestic violence, arguments. And then on the other hand, alcoholism also, like I said, it kind of contributed to those tensions at home. And also women had to discipline children during online schooling, and sometimes fathers, in-laws didn't like it so much. So then women were put in an even more vulnerable position, trying to discipline children to sit through a class. So the disproportionate impact that the pandemic had on men's mental health kind of snowballed into much larger impacts on women. And the irony of it is that we actually did not think about the kind of psychosocial impact the pandemic would have on people. In our study, what we noted was that the actual contraction of virus was, let's say, about 14% of the sample.
Okay.
But almost everyone spoke of the psychosocial impact, and one person likened it to like being lost in a forest, and another person said she does not want to just talk about the pandemic because it gives her stress.
It's crazy how studies like this really hold a mirror to our society, and show us where our priorities should lie, but they don't.
In fairness, the pandemic was a new experience, and even in our study what we found was respondents were graceful. They acknowledged the government's efforts, especially during the first wave, but they were critical of the fact that the measures, while well intended, did not really look at how it would affect the poorest and the most vulnerable households. Right. How sudden closures, how people selling vegetables in roadside shelves. So they had to basically donate vegetables because they did not know what to do with it. And there were certain shops whose goods had expired by the time they could reopen the shops. Right. So they had to absorb those losses on top of suffering income losses. So it was double jeopardy for them. And also the fact that the vaccination drive, while it was very good, people were critical of the fact that was forced on them without giving information, so that they could make an informed decision whether they wanted to take it or not. But it was also an ultimatum, because you either take it and go places, or you don't take it and you are shut out from accessing places.
So human dignity is taken out of the equation in many of these instances.
Exactly. In a rush to kind of control situations, sometimes we create long-term implications, which there can be transient conditions, temporary conditions, but they can become permanent if you don't take like a holistic approach to emergency responses in general.
Sure. We are in conversation with Dr. Ranmini Vithanagama. We go in for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
The most awaited Alun Ardu celebrations. Wellawaya, be ready.
Lanka's precious world heritage.
මිදුලේ අලේ වතුරේ වැලේ කුස්සේ දැලේ දෙපයි දූවිලේ අතරමං හේන අතරට බලාපොරොත්තු කියන සර්වජන විශ්වාසය ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජන පෞර සිංහයින් 20 ලෝක ශූරතාවය දිනා වසර 10.
Sri Lanka, the new champions of the ICC World T20. Well played.
ඒ අභිමානවත් තරගය යලි මෙරට ප්‍රේක්ෂකයින්ට නැරඹීමේ අවස්ථාව. හෙට පෙරවරු 10 සිට TV1 තුලින්.
නංගි කරුණාකර යන වෙලියට අලිමන්ගේ ෂොප් එකට ගිහිල්ලා ප්‍රශ්න දාගත්තා නම් එයාවට තනියම මූණ දීපු දෙන්න.
එහෙම කියලා බෑ. කුරුළු කියන්නේ මගේ ටෙලිඩ්‍රාමා එකේ මේන් ඇක්ට්‍රස්.
මේ කෙල්ලට පුළුවන් ඕනේ මිනිස්සෙක්ව රවට්ට ගන්න. අභිමන් නම් තාම ඉන්නේ ඒ රැවටීම ඇතුලේ.
නීල පබලු අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
TV1. TV for life.
Government settles foreign debt and interest to the tune of $1,909.7 million, says Kirti Thenakun. Election Commission says holding two elections simultaneously is not a feasible scenario. GL, Dilan, Gudheva and others from Freedom People's Congress align with SJB alliance. Prasanna Ranatunga warns that Nama's candidacy could split the SLPP. Nimal Siripala tells SLFP to summon counsel in the absence of Sirisena and co. Activist turned actress Damita remanded.
TV1. TV for life.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back. You're watching the People's Platform. I'm in conversation with Dr. Ranmini Vithanagama, Senior Researcher, International Centre for Ethnic Studies. Our topic of discussion tonight is reimagining vulnerability in the current Sri Lankan context. Ranmini, speak to us about how the pandemic exposed and exacerbated vulnerabilities within Sri Lanka's labour market, particularly for those households engaged in the informal sector.
Yeah, so if you take the informal sector, that is the definition itself is kind of self-explanatory.
Sure.
So that doesn't come under the purview of the formal labour laws and regulations, which means those who are employed in the informal sector, they do not have pensions, they do not have the kinds of rights that formal sector workers usually have. So that makes them vulnerable to job losses, income losses without legal recourse. And that's exactly what we found in our study. We found that if a household has more income coming from casual labor force, meaning if more people in the household are engaged in casual work or temporary work compared to permanent work, those households are at a much higher risk of experiencing income vulnerability. And as to why is kind of, the reasons you find in the qualitative analysis, because if you are a domestic worker, you are not allowed to go and work. Because of the mobility restrictions.
Sure.
And the landlord is not bound to pay anything if you don't show up for work. Same thing for casual laborers who are working outside. Then also if you take the construction sector, tourism, most people who lost jobs were doing contract based or informal jobs, where they really can't do much if the employers let go. So that's the reason why informal sector was largely affected. And there was another factor, whatever jobs that could be converted to online forms could continue. For example, if you are a private tuition provider, you could easily shift online and do it.
Right.
And so if you really look at it, some of the work that requires your physical presence are also low skilled or semi-skilled or unskilled work. Because
Right.
for example, if you are a mason, you have to go to the site to work.
Sure.
So those are the ways in which the informal sector was disproportionately affected.
Ranmini, your study makes it crystal clear that we need a more comprehensive approach to vulnerability, especially within policy realms. So how do we go about reimagining vulnerability?
Yes, so what we need to first understand is vulnerability is, although it comes into spotlight during a crisis, it's there, although it's not visible to us. We focus a lot on poverty, but not so much vulnerability. So our definitions of poor and non-poor really, they don't work. And I understand the new social registry has an expanded version of what poverty means. So from the pandemic, what we know is that the new poor are not necessarily non-poor. They were very close to the poverty line. So one shock and they come below the poverty line.
Right.
So it's important to have an expanded version of what poverty constitutes. And the second version is we have to understand that usually vulnerability is kind of exacerbating existing inequalities. So we need to go back and see what these existing inequalities are. So the motivation is usually to address only the proximate factors. So give cash grants, give in-kind assistance, do whatever to kind of support people during the crisis. But the more important thing is look at the systemic barriers, the structural problems, what are the bottlenecks in the economy, what are the bottlenecks in the legal frameworks, how can you address those so that, each time a pandemic or some other crisis hits, you have made people more resilient.
Sure. So we can't keep adopting a reactionary approach.
Exactly.
And there has to be preparedness.
Exactly. And the pandemic has given like a plethora of lessons if you want to really learn to see how to, some of the key mistakes. Don't take a, unilateral approach to emergency responses. Take a holistic, multidisciplinary approach. Look at what countries elsewhere are doing and look at the ways in which households can develop their asset base. Financial literacy is critical because we don't learn about it anywhere. So we learn it on the go. I have made mistakes, I'm sure you have too. So that's not a luxury poor people can afford to have. So you need, financial literacy is critical. And also it's important for households to have, especially women, to have access to inclusive finance. Our financial system is very discriminatory in the sense you need collateral, a permanent job, predictable incomes to be able to take loans from the formal sector. So what do you do when you can't do that? You go to an informal lender and then you are stuck in a vicious trap.
Yeah.
So so it's very difficult to condense into this discussion, but there's a lot that you can look at, reflect on and learn from.
Ranmini, if we park the research, the study for a bit, I'd like your opinion on this. We are obsessed with fetishizing a resilience, and this needs to stop. We need to stop normalizing struggle and strife, and that has a lot to do with our psyche, our mindset as well. How do you view this?
I'll take on a women's perspective on this. So we kind of romanticize the idea of a woman who does it all, takes care of kids, takes care of home, is a superwoman concept. I think that's I don't think that's the right way to go about women's empowerment, because then it puts on so many burdens on women. If you look at the time use, then women are actually time poor. They might not be monetary poor, but they're time poor. So the idea is So it's, while it's important to have grit and resilience and all that, there's no need to kind of romanticize and embody that and think of it as really important, because if our systems and structures are in place so that they empower and enable and catalyze the socio-economic well-being of both men and women, and also those of non-binary genders, then we don't have to talk about it as if some kind of a major achievement, because resilience is in effect because it in a way mirrors the weaknesses in our systems.
And finally, speak to us about some of the recommendations in this study. What specific actions can policymakers take to address the identified vulnerabilities?
Yes, so one of the main recommendations that we have is to promote growth in economic sectors that can create decent jobs in the formal sector. So if you take Sri Lanka's kind of economic sector, agriculture contributes about 9% to the economy, but it about 25% of the labor force is employed in the agriculture sector. So that means for a small piece of the pie, a lot of people are fighting, or that's where they are engaged. So that kind of shows the disproportionate way in which our labor force is kind of scattered. So how can economic growth then lead to decent jobs in growing sectors? For example, tourism. In the tourism sector, many of the jobs are informal. So the next requirement is then also to make more of the economy formal. There's no real incentive for businesses, enterprises to become formal unless the government provides incentives for them to do so. So there should be kind of a friendly, sensitive environment where more of the informal economy can be absorbed into the formal sector. And this is very important that we adopt a rights-based approach. If you take persons with disabilities, poor and marginalized, we still have this very benevolent, charity-based mindset when we support them. And we do not really think of them from a human rights perspective. So, and most importantly, we need to kind of support economic growth that respects nature, is a good steward of nature, and also thinks of people's well-being. So it's not just economic growth is critical because that's how you come out of poverty.
Sure.
But it needs to be equitable, or at the very least create enough opportunities so people can kind of pick up those opportunities and grow.
Dr. Ranmini Vithanagama, thank you so much for coming in today, for sharing your perspectives and the findings of this fabulous study. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching us. We'll see you again next Monday. Have a safe weekend. Good night.